everyone, this is an introduction to complex numbers. I equals the square root of -1, and I'm going to tell you where this arises. So in general, if you have like x squared minus 25 equals 0, and you want to solve for x, you add the 25 to both sides. So 0 plus 25 is 25. Then you take the square root of both sides. And don't forget to put your plus and minus. And so this simplifies to x equals plus or minus 5. And students, don't forget to put your plus and minus anytime you take a square root, because the minus counts too, because -5 squared is 25, because -5 times -5, which is what this is 25. Now what occurs is when you have something like this, x squared plus 25 equals 0. When you have that, you subtract 25 from both sides. You take the square root of both sides. And don't forget you do your plus and minus. So you get x equals plus or minus -25. The square root of that. So basically, there is no such answer for that because two negatives make a positive. So I believe it was Descartes that came up with, well, what he wants to do is write this as plus or minus square root of -1 times the square root of 25. In that case, you get x equals plus or minus the square root of 25 is 5, and you have times square root of -1. And furthermore, instead of keep writing this, because when you're trying to type or write, that's hard to do, so we're just going to call that I. So the answer would be x equals plus or minus 5i. And so that's all that is. That's just the square root of -1. You can write it with the I or the square root of -1, but I looks a lot nicer. So furthermore, we're going to go and look at more of these. So we have I equals the square root of -1, and so what is I squared? Well, I squared is two of these, so you just write it down twice, times the square root of -1. And we could also write this as -1 to the 1/2. Instead of the radical way, write it as the rational way. And when you do your exponents, you get -1 to the 1/2 plus 1/2. This is your exponents. And you get -1 to 1, which is just -1. So I squared is -1. This is an important one. All right, so I cubed you could write is I squared times I. Well, I squared is just -1, and I is just negative square root of 1. So that just equals -I. Okay? Again, this number here is just I, so I just took the negative of I. And I to the 4th, I can write as I squared times I squared. That's I to the 4th. Well, we already know that. So I squared is -1 right here. And then we have another one. -1 times -1 is just 1. And the most important ones are I. We use that a lot. We use I squared a lot, and we use I to the 4th a lot. Now let's look at what I to the 5th would be. I to the 5th would just be I to the 4th times I. Well, I to the 4th is just 1. So we get 1 times I, which just equals I. So I to the 5th just equals back to I. Now let's try I to the 6th. I to the 6th equals I to the 4th times I squared. So that's 1 times I squared. Oops, I can't get my dots here. So this just equals I squared. And if you notice what's going to happen, it's going to keep repeating. I to the 7th equals I to the 4th times I cubed. And that's just 1 times I cubed because of this 1 here. So that just equals I cubed again. And it just repeats itself every 4. That's I to the 4th times I to the 4th. So that just equals 1. So we're back. It just repeats every 4. So a good way to do this is to take your exponent and whatever the remainder is, you look at it like this. So let's look at I to the 10th. So you take 10 and you divide by 4. So you get 2. You subtract, you get 2. So remainder is 2. So it's just I squared because it keeps repeating. We already went through these. And you can just keep repeating until you get to this. So on an SAT test, you might have what is I to the 101 power. And all you do is you take 101, divide it by 4. We know that goes into 25 times 4 is 100. Subtract and you get 1. Your remainder is 1. So the answer is I to the first power, which is just I. And that's it. You need to kind of process this, and you will be using these in various problems that you use for applying complex numbers. Thank you, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Miss Shaw's class. Boy, I love math. Miss Shaw's class, Miss Shaw's class.
Don't fail! Watch Miss Shaw's videos for free.